Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. In this lecture, we conclude our discussion of democracy and American culture, 1820 to 1840. We're going to talk in this lecture about the rise of the Whigs and the election of 1840. Martin Van Buren, one of Andrew Jackson's closest accomplices, was handpicked to be Jackson's successor in the election of 1836. Van Buren and Jackson were not much like each other, certainly in physical stature, and Van Buren was nicknamed the Little Magician or the Slippery Elm, sort of in contrast to Old Hickory. Jackson's financial policies and his destruction of the national bank led to issues in the national economy. Without the national bank, state banks had much greater control, and they were more likely to issue loans, which created speculation. And by 1836, the economy was growing overheated with lots of land sales and speculation, which will lead us to the Panic of 1837, the economic depression, which we're going to be talking about momentarily. The speculation in land led to large numbers of foreclosures on land and business failures and growing unemployment as well, which led to an array of miseries which are depicted in this cartoon of that era. There were also foreign contributions to this. The Bank of England in 1837 had raised its interest rates and made it harder for people to get credit in England, and this led to further kind of outstanding debts and defaulted loans. And finally, the price of cotton plummeted in 1837 on the global market, and which left even more Americans unable to pay off their mortgages or loans or debts. Some attributed a new nickname to Martin Van Buren in the midst of all this economic trouble: Martin Van Ruin. The Whigs had lost the election of 1836 to Martin Van Buren, partly because of divisions within their own party. And they were determined not to let the same happen again in 1840. They rallied firmly behind their candidate, General William Henry Harrison, who some nicknamed Old Granny or Old Tippecanoe. Remember, we talked about William Henry Harrison previously for his victory over the Shawnee Indians at the Battle of Tippecanoe way back in 1811. So at this time, he was almost 70 years old and subject to a considerable amount of ridicule. One newspaper suggested that we should just give Harrison a barrel of hard cider and let him sit out the election. But the Whigs seized on these images and turned them to their advantages. If you want to give him hard cider, he'll take hard cider. His campaign managers transformed the image of Harrison into a simple farmer living in a log cabin, drinking hard cider just like the rest of us. You kind of see one image of that here. This is known as the Log Cabin Campaign. And while not the first official presidential campaign, we've talked about a number already, it really does take on a modern kind of context, similar to our campaigns of today. It's filled with marches and parades and campaign slogans, including Tippecanoe and Tyler too, which many schoolchildren learn even today. It's a memorable slogan referring to Harrison and his vice presidential candidate, John Tyler. Democratic newspapers complained, as one of them wrote, that we have taught them how to conquer us, as Harrison and his team adopted many of the methods that Andrew Jackson and Van Buren had used previously. And another complained, we could meet the Whigs on the field of argument and beat them. But how do we respond when they lay down the weapons of argument and attack us with musical notes? in reference to the many campaign songs that were circulating at that time. Like the Democrats before them, the Whigs now launched attacks against their opponent, casting Martin Van Buren as a man of fine taste sipping on champagne while the nation endured the panic of 1837. The Whigs also appealed to women. Although women at that time could not vote, the Whigs issued several campaign addresses directed at women to encourage their husbands or sons to vote for William Henry Harrison. Thanks to this vigorous and effective campaign, William Henry Harrison won a resounding victory in the election, about a 4-to-1 margin in the Electoral College and 150,000 or so in the popular vote. Harrison gave a lengthy address at his inauguration and then went on to become the shortest serving president ever, contracting pneumonia and dying within just a few months. Vice President John Taylor then assumed the presidency, and some nicknamed him His Accidency. So the Whigs and the Democrats are going to hold the national stage in politics as we enter the next era of our nation's history, the critical antebellum period when we begin to see the debates and discussions that ultimately lead us tumbling into the Civil War. So let me just kind of summarize the views of these two political parties, which we're going to be talking about much more over the next lectures. The Whigs, for their part, favored a strong central government. They supported Henry Clay's American system. Remember this process of internal improvements like roads and bridges, a strong central government, and a strong central economy. They also believed in governance by a talented and virtuous elite, rather than the broad franchise and leaving the vote, as they would describe it, to the mob or the rabble. And while they didn't include blacks, women, Indians, or other minorities in voting rights, they did at least support a sort of paternalistic protection of those groups. They were attentive to them as needing protection and safety within the government. Democrats, for their part, supported a broader extension of democracy, but only for white men. And so their belief and treatment of blacks and Native Americans was perhaps less positive than the Whigs, because they didn't even believe in this idea of protecting them. They were suspicious of the market economy and big government, so opposed to the strong central government and opposed to Clay's American system. And they believed in the expansion of agriculture, which meant, in many cases, the expense of Native Americans and the process of acquiring the lands currently held by Native Americans, as we've discussed the process of removal previously. So these are some of the core beliefs of these two political parties, which we're going to be discussing much more in the lectures ahead.